Hey there guys, this is Obsidian Chill. Got another video for today, and in this one we're taking a closer in-depth look at the controller role. So everything from different builds like power trolling, buff trolling. We're looking at artifacts, allies, wipe mods, control resistance and immunity in terms of with the stuns. As per usual in my guides, we're going to have timestamps in the description and in the comment section of the video. So if you need to skip to those relevant sections. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so taking a look at the first aspect, this is more like an FYI section. It's going to be more relevant for Elite and Elite Plus content, but it's still the same logic still applies for Vent and Regular, just that it's not noticed because the damage is much lower. It's not going to be an impact. But you know, in the past, the controller role was designed not only to give power and debuffs, but also for crowd control. You had hard stun abilities. You had stuns like a paralyzing dart in the past used to be a hard stun, so then it was much harder to break out of that. Where controlled, like say Gauss Grenade was a weaker stun. You also had for a while, the more dominance you had, the longer the stun duration. It would add like an extra 1,000 dom or whatever would add like another second to the stun. Stats revamp changed all that, and the breakup profiles and control resistance immunity is pretty much destroyed. So the issue in endgame content is that if you're a controller just kind of mindlessly spamming debuffs, the ads will break out and resist and become immune to tank stuns or tank juggles, and then that interferes with the tank because then they're taking unnecessary damage. So what I mean by that is, say you start off a raid, you pop your debuff and paralyzing dart, stuns all the ads, they break out, and now if I'm a tank and I go to stun, now some are resisting. So if I'm trying to pull them and juggle them with like a chromatic emitter or like a resonating gale or whatever atomics thermochemical, they can't do that because I'm constantly stunning them. Now they're all resisting. You see all the ads resisting, not being stunned. That's damage that the tank is taking because they cannot juggle the ads properly. So it's one of those things where it's not the controller's fault, it's the game's fault, it's the game design. But the issue is that controllers aren't aware of that fact. So especially, say for example, like 6-dimension lead, that was an issue on the first boss when you had those dog pile of ads and the tank's kind of trying to manage them off to the side. If you're throwing a debuff on them, then it breaks the controller, the tank's juggle cycle, because now they're going to be immune and resist the chronomatic emitter or their next juggle or like whatever move they're using to juggle the ads with. So that's the issue. You can overcome that in two different ways, actually 3 different ways technically. The first way is that you wait for the tank to go first, because then the tank will juggle them and stun them or CC them, and then when you apply your debuff, they're going to resist your debuff because you went second. So it's always waiting for the tank to use. If you're watching the tank closely, you can wait till see them to use their ability, and then you can debuff properly, and it's not going to interfere because they're going to resist your debuff, which is fine. And then by the time they become not resistant, the tank is using their cycle again. The other method is to use an artifact called Bob Comlink, which is going to give you an ability called Bird's Blitz. So Bird's Blitz applies debuffs, which is what you want as a controller to apply for your other artifact rotation, but there's no CC. So I can hit Bird's Blitz, infinite amount of times. It's going to damage and apply the debuffs, but it's not going to have any CC immunity effect. So you're free to use this anytime you want in combat. It's not going to interfere with the tanks. So that's why you see a lot of endgame or controllers using Bob Comlink. In the past, I haven't recommended it because Bob Comlink serves, it works in like an artifact swap build, which I'll get into it, but just as a base control artifact, it's not that great. It's used for these situations to basically improve your performance. So the third way is you can go Quantum. Quantum is the only controller power that has stuns like Time Shift that don't apply CC effect. So then you're fine. So if you don't want to level up Bob Comlink and you don't want to know what the tanks in endgame, then you can go Quantum controller and then not worry about that as well. So that's basically 3 ways. So I just want to touch on that if you ever run into that as a tank situation, I know the tanks out there definitely want me to say that because as a tank as well, you definitely feel it in raids, and it's sometimes better not to even use debuffs in some situations. Like say the Clock Tower final boss, if you use the debuffs on the ads where the tank couldn't pull them back, then it just became an issue because they have to resist. So let's jump into the next section. So taking a look at the white mods, for weapon, it's always going to be replenishing adapter for the extra power return. For your helmet, it's going to be dependent on what power set you are. So Event Horizon, Bastion, Battle Drone, etc. For your neck mod, it's going to be replenishing procs. For your chest mod, you have two choices. If you're buff trolling, it's going to be hardy. And if you're power trolling or struggling in power, it's going to be power efficiency. For your back mod, typically there's not one specific for controlling. There's the cooldown reduction on your shields. Then mental also has accelerated horrific visage, so that'll tie into your supercharge generator, or you can take out like breakout protection, breakout regen, stuff like that. For your hand mod, really comes down to two choices as well. If your gadgets are mental, then you can take improved stealth for an extra personal shield, as well as if you want to use the extra loadout for anything. There's max damage, which is basically the default. And power channeling, even though you're using a finisher, it's not an issue, because even if your finisher gets interrupted, it's still applying the tick of the finisher for Toxic Encore. And then for your foot mod, it's going to be Tumbling Master. For allies for controlling, we do have some options depending on your build. So you should be running a finisher to proc Toxic Encore for the extra debuff. Once again, you don't necessarily have to. You can always do another ally, but ideally you should be running the finisher. So that means we've got Toxic Encore as our support. The secondary support that ideally you should be running is going to be Black Lantern under Death Metal Batman, which provides when you hit a control debuff, drops a pool that restores 25% power over time. Now there are some exceptions where some people run Death Metal Batman for the Death Metal Solo, which provides the extra debuff. You can refer to my stacking debuffs video in the description in the comment section as well to have more detail on that. So then if you're running Death Metal Batman as the solo, you've got options where you can run Cyborg for all your base for the passive power recovery. There is also, if you're doing Supercharge Generator, you also have Black Adam for power of A10 for this extra Supercharge regen. You also have, not so much on a main one, but say you're doing like controlling an alt and you don't want to dump a lot of money and resources into allies, you could take a House of Legends bot for retain 50% of your power, maximum power when you stun an enemy. That works as well, because a rare is very cheap to level. Same thing with an epic in terms of Cyborg. But typically you should be running Black Lantern, and then you just choose whatever DPS ally, Crypto for single target, or House of Legends bot if you have that leveled, Superman or Shazam, whatever you want for a combat ally. So touching on power trolling itself as a build is not as required as it once was, especially now that you have, precision players are very power efficient, besides the outliers like say like Gadget's perk using Suppressor Turret, which was specifically designed to increase the power cost. Also you have might players, say like light DPSing, atomic DPSing, mental DPSing, Gadget's DPSing. Those are some outlier abilities where they may cost more power than what you as a buff troll can provide. But if you're going to power troll, some people may differ on opinion in this, but I always stick to this tried and true build. It has served me well throughout the past, and I believe has the maximum potential to have return power. So if you're stuck in a situation where you have to return power and you can't provide buffs, then look at this one here. So we'll put up on the screen here the skill point spec and the augment spec. It's as you would think. You're focusing on vitalization, and then your extra stats you can put in might and power and health for the power return. Sorry, not health, but the might and power for the power return to maintain your rotation. You're also taking a hybrid build. This one comes down, so with hybrid, you're looking at using Solar Flare. So Handblaster Solar Flare has great supercharge regen, which is the focus of this build to return power. If you're not going to use Solar Flare between each power, you're going to run out of power eventually. And then you want to switch to a superpowered spec. So a hybrid spec, not only does it give you extra stats, it does, if as long as you're using Solar Flare between combos, then you will have the same amount of power regen as you would with a superpowered spec. So that basically comes down to user preference at that point. If you want to be able to use that. If you don't think you're going to be using that, then you're going to have to switch to a superpowered spec. So taking a look at the loadout, we have Supercharge Generator, the instant power return, We have defense debuff, attack debuff, a shield, and supercharge. So basically this build revolves around clipping everything, a supercharge generator off cooldown. You can also use the Black Adam ally that returns the extra supercharge. So if you want to Black Adam, power of A10, supercharge generator abilities generate 35% more supercharge. If you're doing this build, I would recommend that, but many people have leveled Black Adam just for that one ability. So I can understand why you may not have access to that, but that just enhances the build. So what it boils down to is just basically you're going to be using Solar Flare and clipping everything. As you can see, the debuff applied from Black Adam, so I'm getting power return from that. So you're just basically using your powers off cooldown. And what this build will do is it's going to provide you the maximum amount of supercharged regen. So you're going to be using Bastion as often as possible, which is going to lead to your greater power return. So you get more group shields, you get more supercharged regen, you've got all 3 debuffs active, proccing everything else. The one downside obviously of this build is since I'm basically using debuffs off cooldown, if you refer back to the section of this video where I talked about control resistance and immunity, that becomes an issue. But like I said, in event content and normal content, it's not going to matter. And as you see, I've already in Bastion, so when you use your supercharge, then you can basically use that again, and you're just continuing your rotation. So that's what I feel to provide the best return. So obviously, every single artifact build is always going to have Amulet of Rao. The nice thing about Parasite Power Harness is you're going to provide a little bit of a buff to the control for the precision DPS, but the main aspect here is you're looking at hitting an enemy with a control debuff grants you and up to 7 group members power equal to 10% of your VIT. So what that means in terms of actual numbers is that it increases the power pool. It doesn't just grant power to a player, it increases their power pool. And as a might DPS, if they're superpowered spec or if anyone's superpowered spec, the regen is based on the percentage of your maximum power pool. That's how the regen works for superpowered specs. So if you're increasing their power pool, you increase their regen, and that's what Parasite Power Harness does. So a lot of those might powers that are heavy, like a mental might, atomic might, light might, gadgets might, you're increasing their power regen by using Parasite Power Harness. And then basically it goes to scrap. This just helps with using Bastion more often, faster off cooldown, and then more supercharged regen from your abilities. Specifically as mental, you do have the ability called Accelerated Horrific Visage. So this will actually lower the cooldown on your supercharged generator. This mental is the only power that has a cooldown reduction for back mod for their supercharged generator. So that can be very helpful. So this is a power build. Like I said, it's not going to be something where you're going to run into a lot of times or I want to touch on the buff trolling section. But if you're looking for maximum power regeneration, then you're looking at this type of build setup. So for buff trolling, it's a very different spec from power trolling. So instead of taking all fidelization, augments, origin augments, skill point spec, you are taking health and dom. So for your skill points, you're speccing health first, and then putting everything else left over into VIT, because VIT is still useful for buff trolling, it's just that you're focusing on health. And then for augments, you're taking dom and health, which you would think would be for tanks, but actually for controllers, they have the highest health increases. So that's what you're taking. So everything revolves around buff trolling because there's certain artifacts, like for example, Cog and Tetra, where they're based on how much health you have, it provides might and precision to the group. And then you have artifacts like Claw, which provide extra criticals and extra stats as well to the group. Same thing, Rings of Azwar, which will increase the group's health, Distant Refractor, which increase the group's health. You have Parasite Harness, which same thing, based on your VIT, you'll get the extra precision for the debuffs. So it basically revolves around providing extra stats to the group. Because in terms of being a power troll, you're just providing power to the group. So if your group doesn't need power, which most of the time healers do not need power because they have the artifact called Purple Healing Ray, which provides lots of power, personal regen for them. Tanks don't need power because they're just not using as much power. Plus, like even power heavy tanks like a tank and Atomic and Fire have their own mechanics dealing with power return, or they can simply run Cyborg if they wanted to. Precision DPS rarely need power unless there's something like gadgets using Suppressor Turret. A lot of might powers don't need power either. Most single target rotations involve multiple channels, finishers, heat vision, which not much of a drain on power. And then there's some obviously outliers like I've mentioned previously in the video for melee rotations, but same thing. In general, power trolling is not needed because there are so many different ways out there for other roles to regen their power. However, being a buff troll, you're providing stats to each group member. So primarily for the DPS, which means that the content goes faster because the DPS are stronger. You're providing stats to the healers, to the tanks, increasing their dom and resto, so the shields are stronger. The tanks have better survivability. So overall, think of buff trolling as providing as much of a statistical increase to the group as possible. And that's the focus. A lot of people call this inventory trolling. There are different levels to buff trolling. In terms of a spec, I'll quickly just put up on the screen here in terms of skill points and augments. Like I said, it's just focusing on health and then putting everything else into it. But there's different levels. A lot of people will see videos or freak out saying like, oh, you need 11 different artifacts to buff troll. There are different levels to it where you can still be a successful buff troll, but you don't have to be in your inventory all the time. I'll certainly show this as it progresses in terms of being more intricate of a rotation and swapping more artifacts. But for example, if you want to just take buff trolling at its face and you don't want to artifact swap, say you're on PS4 or Switch, Xbox, which like the artifact swapping doesn't work as well because of hardware, then you could just basically, or you just don't want artifact swap. So then Amulet of Ra, like I said, that's going to be on every single control artifact rotation. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But then all you have to do is take Amulet of Ra, Cog, and Tetra. So basically, you are losing the buffs from Claw, which will be the critical increase and the 7% might restoration and dominance, but you're still buff trolling with these three artifacts, and they don't require any kind of artifact swap. So say, for example, we're just taking our stats here. My might is 162 and my precision is 59. So let's say 163 and 60k. And with using Tetra and Cog and Amulet, I'm still providing the maximum amount of debuffs, and then I'm getting the extra stats increases for the DPS for precision and might without having to worry about any kind of artifact swapping. So weapon wise, the easiest weapon for this in terms of timing is going to be brawling and using Shuriken Storm Mastery. So I just do a normal troller rotation, just like I would anything else. And if I go into my stats and check here, I've gone up from 163 to 186, and my precision has jumped from 59 to 84k. And that's what I would be providing to the group. And it'd be even more based on your health increases. So there's different there's different trinkets that provide increased health in terms of like a 5% increase. Other than that, you could take like health soders, whatever omega. Like the higher health pool, the higher the buffs you can provide. But it's as simple as that. So I'm still being a controller. I'm still being able to stun with Anomaly if I wanted to. I got Time Shift and Warp Barrage, which don't have any interference with specifically for Quantum. They don't have any CC effects, but I can still maintain my controller rotation. You know, I've got Cyborg too if I run into any kind of power issues, but at the same time, I'm not artifact swapping whatsoever, but I'm still keeping a massive increase for the group on precision and might. So it's one of those things where I'm still providing plenty of power because I'm clipping recharge off every rotation. So the group is still getting plenty of power, but I'm not overdoing it with Parasite Harness and Scrap because it's not needed. I can run Tetra and Cog, still provide great bonuses for the DPS without having to worry about any sort of artifact swapping. So when people tell you buff trolling is all inventory trolling, that's not necessarily true. You can still get away without it and still provide those bonuses to the DPS. So think of it, this is like the base level or level 1 for buff trolling. There's definitely levels like 2, 3, 4, 5, and as we go up, which I'm going to show you. But think of this as level 1 buff trolling without any sort of artifact swapping. So the next level of buff trolling, technically if you want to call it level 2, is working in the Claw. So the Claw artifact is very beneficial for buff trolling because it gives not only stats to the DPS, but also to the healers and tanks. So we're looking at 7% might, restoration, and dominance, as well as 5% critical chance and magnitude. So the whole reason you have artifact swapping is because the effects of the artifact last for a certain duration after you've taken the artifact off. It's just how the artifacts were designed. So for example, if I look at my stats, we've got my might is 161, 54k dominance, 59k dominance, 54k resto on all my crits here. Now, if I take Claw, which is you have to hit recharge, Claw on, now I'm going to take Claw off, so I don't have it equipped. But as you can see, my might is still at 165, 62k dominance, restoration 58, and all my crits have gone up. And you'll see I don't have the artifact equipped. It's going to disappear after 12 seconds and then go back to normal. So that's where the terminology of our artifact swapping comes into play for controlling, because I can keep the effects of the might increase from Tetra, the precision increase from Cog, the claw buffs. I can keep the health buffs from rings. I can keep the precision and power pool increases from Parasite. I can keep the health buff for Refractor, etc. So I can keep all these effects of the artifacts after they've been taken off my primary artifact slot. So that's where the swapping comes to mind. So I can swap in multiple artifacts at a time, basically, and then kind of keep their effects as long as I have them activated. So this is where this comes into play. There's a few different methods. Like if you don't want to use Bop Comlink, you could take Claw on all the time and then basically just swap between Cog and Tetra. So well, we're going to take off Bop Comlink here. So say for example, I just wanted to troll like this and just kind of hit my recharge. I've got my Claw up, then I would swap in Tetra, hit another power or the finisher to proc to keep going for the Toxic Encore. Then up my inventory, do Cog. Same thing, I can keep swapping this while keeping Claw active. The disadvantage of this is that if you have Claw constantly on your loadout, for one, it provides slower power regen because then it's based on the Claw buff, which basically reduces your, increases your passive, so increases your pot, but then your recharge does nothing. So if I have Claw equipped all the time, then basically I can still hit recharge, but it's not going to provide any power to the group. It's just going to increase my pot tick. So then I'm wasting power myself as a clipping move, but I'm not giving power to the group. Where Claw trolling, sometimes you can get away with it in terms of the group, but sometimes if like a gadgets prec or anything like that, you're not going to be able to get away with just having Claw on all the time. If you swap Claw, you keep the Claw effects, but then you don't have any of the Claw disadvantages. So if I swap off Claw and take that, then any kind of recharge I hit in between the swap, I'm going to give instant power regen to everyone else on top of my pot ticks. So that basically boils down to you. If you don't want to run Bop Comlink or don't want to level that artifact, you can certainly keep on Amulet, Claw, and then just basically swap between Cog and Tetra. So then the only swaps I'd be doing, I'd open my loadout, put on Cog, then swap back, do Tetra again. And I don't have to do back to back. I can wait the 12 seconds. So if I swap on Cog, I can do this. Rotation. I don't have to swap right away, so it's not like I'm constantly in my inventory. I just have to swap in Cog and Tetra every 12 seconds. That's all it is, because that's how long it will last. So that's your option as well. If you don't want to be in your inventory after every single weapon swap, you don't have to. It just basically changes your build slightly and reduces and basically increases the disadvantages to the group. But once again, the other option as well is you put Bop Comlink on, and then basically you're swapping technically 3 artifacts, but then just 1 artifact at a time. So if I'm going to be using Bop Comlink, I can keep Bop Comlink on, and Claw will always be my swap artifact. So then I can start off with Bird Blitz, and then pop Tetra, pop my Supercharge on it. I can swap during that onto Cog, and hit Bird Blitz again off cooldown, and basically just kind of rotate that. And then basically you've got 12 seconds to be able to put Claw back on to restart the cycle and basically swap between Cog and Tetra. So same thing, using this, you're not in your inventory every second after every weapon swap because you're only doing 1 artifact at a time, and each of them will last 12 seconds. So it does give you a little bit of breather room. You're not necessarily opening your inventory that often, but you're still having the maximum impact. So that's your choice for level 2. If you're going to run Bop, then you're swapping 3 artifacts within 12 seconds. And remember that you have to hit a Might Power to activate Tetra, and you have to do a Weapon Mastery combo like Brawling to proc Cog, and then you just have to hit Recharge for Claw. So that's your 3 artifacts for level 2, and then if you want to run Bop or not. So for level 3 buff trolling, or at least what I'm referring to level 3 buff trolling for the sake of this video, you're always going to have a starting artifact rotation of Amulet of Rao, Bop Comlink, and Claw of Alcond. you're always going to have these 3 start, because basically once you hit claw, you're going to get the claw buffs for the starting 12 seconds. You also get supplementing energies, which increases your VIT per group member. And then that ties into the next artifact, which is Entwined Rings of Azar, which using group power heal grants you and up to 7 group members health equal to 20% of your VIT. So you've buffed your VIT and all the other stats with claw. Then you can go into rings, so then your health is buffed as high as it will get. And then you can go into doing your weapon mastery with cog, hitting your power with tetra, and then the advantage with parasite power harness. As you see, hitting an enemy with a controller debuff grants you and up to 7 group members power and precision equal to 1.67 of your VIT, and the stacks for each type of controller debuff, which ties into Bop Comlink. So we'll just kind of take a quick example just to kind of show you the individual aspects of it here. I can't really show the interaction with claw and rings because I'm just solo, I'm not in a group. But for example, taking a look at Parasite. So if I use Burt's, so we'll go back to our debuffs here. So my prec right now is 56,118. And I can show in the combat log too. If we go back through the combat log, my current effects. So if I use, we're going to use claw. Then say if I clip in Parasite Power Harness, use Bird's Blitz again. Now if I go into my combat log, I have 3 procs of the Parasite Power Harness, as well as the claw buff. So we'll let that expire, and then same thing. So if we start off with claw, then we swap in Parasite to use Bird's Blitz, and you can see my prec is now up to 71k, and I've got those stacking 3 debuffs. So that's how the interaction works with Parasite Harness and Bop Comlink. And the reason why we always have Bop Comlink on the second slot, as of what I referred to earlier in the video, we're talking about CC immunity. So that can be any power set, it could be gadgets, that could be whichever control power set light. As long as I have Bop Comlink on, I can use Bird's Blitz, apply the 3 debuffs, which saves me time because I'm going to be artifact swapping, and it gives that synergy with Parasite Power Harness and the synergy with not providing any sort of stun or immunity to the group on the ads for the tanks. So that's pretty much the order. So basically you go claw, then rings will set up your health, and then you can go into cog, then tetra, and parasite. You're also setting up your finisher because we're running Toxic Encore. And using Bird's Blitz is going to proc Black Lantern, so we've got the extra power return pool there as well while we're inventory swapping. And then basically between every artifact, you're going to be at least hitting a recharge, because since we don't have claw on, you can get the instant power regen. So I know that's a lot to take in, and it is. This is not something that, like I said, you don't have to do this level of buff trolling. You can easily get away with either level 1 or level 2. It's basically, this comes down to player preference. Do you need this level of artifact swapping to complete content? No. I mean, you can complete any sort of content without this level of artifact swapping. It's not mandatory. It's just basically something you can do to provide the maximum amount of statistical increase to your group. If you want to be, the best troller you can be by the definition of being a buff troll, then this is the artifact common you can use. So it's going to be, that's 7 artifacts that you have to have leveled up, because you can get away with Bop at 160 because the 200 just increases its little power ticks. But Amulet of Brow has to be 200, Claw has to be 200. Cog and Tetra, technically you can get away with it being at 160, but once again, if it's at 200, you're applying the maximum buff. Ring, the same thing. Just as the higher the artifact goes, then the higher group return is going to be. So like I said, this is called inventory trolling, but at the same time, don't feel pressured to use it because it's not required for content. It's just something you can do extra to be, consider yourself a better troll. And the reason why I have these other 4 artifacts, you'll see in the next level, which is going to be level 4. I'll show a clip here, but technically you'd be swapping in your supercharge. Anytime you're going to use like a supercharge, you want to swap in scrap so you can get the extra regen and the cooldown reduction. You can also technically swap in just a refractor if you're going to use a pull, because then that'll buff your health even more. But you have to be aware of this overwrites with the tank. So if you have to make sure that your tank is not running refractor themselves, because if they are, then it's going to be a waste for you. And then you have the typical swap artifacts when you're swapping an orbital. You can use Dead King, swapping a super supply drop. You're going to use Philosopher's Stone. So these ones are technically, these two are outside of buff trolling. These are just swap artifacts in general. And then these are basically super extra ones that basically that comes down to a personal preference. So essentially what the rotation will look like, just to give you an idea, will be this here. So this is an older clip I had from iKaraoke and Sourceball, which is a good exemplar of the level 3 buff trolling. So buff trolling, when you actually see it in practice, it's different depending on what platform you play on. So I'm not talking about like Xbox, Switch, I'm talking about controller versus PC. So if you're a PC player and open up your inventory, it tracks where your cursor icon is. So it could be that your cursor is like way off to the side. It could be on like your second monitor if you have two monitors set up. It's pretty frustrating. You can't know where your PC cursor is. You can try to keep it in the same location for the quick swaps. But if you're on a controller, it always opens up to the first slot in your inventory. So that's why I see some people, they've organized their inventory in terms of vertical. So basically they work their way down. I've seen ones where it's horizontal and they work their artifacts aside across horizontally. That is a player preference. So with this as well, I'm not sure, I can't remember if I mentioned it directly, but the Rings of Azar buff, it lasts for 30 seconds, the rest are 12. So the cog tetra buff is going to elapse after 12 seconds. The claw buff, you'll see it, the icon, kind of like the crystals will start to disappear towards 12 seconds as well. The bop com link for Bird's Blitz, that's going to be 6 seconds. So you have to make sure that you're applying your debuffs, reapplying every 6 seconds. It's got a 3-second cooldown, but the debuffs themselves last 3 seconds. But with this, it's not too much of a power cost. You can always clip that each time off cooldown just to make sure that you have that in your rotation. Before you use Parasite, you have Bird's Bliss off cooldown because you'll have to reapply that for Parasite each time. But other than that, you see the flow. Yes, a lot of people are going to say this is too excessive. I'm not going to be in my inventory the entire time. This is why I'm just showing this as something you can do. I don't feel, like I said before, don't feel pressure to do it. There's other options. You can still buff troll without going your inventory for the like 7 plus artifacts, or technically 8 if you work in scrap. So this is level 3. I'm going to be showing level 4 in a moment. But like I said, don't feel pressured or peer pressured into doing this. Buff trolling is still very successful, but there's just different ways to approach it if you want to. So this is a clip from Dishonor, so thank you for providing that. This basically takes into everything that we saw in level 3 and then basically takes it to the next level for max or level 4 buff trolling, which is basically every artifact combination that you can as a controller use to provide the maximum amount of buffs to the group. So like I said before, this is not a required play style. This is something that's optional. There's different ways you can do it in terms of different levels, as you've seen, depending on your comfortability with artifact swapping. So the difference is here, you're going to see the loadout change where you're going to see Mesmerizing Lasso, and you saw it earlier while I was explaining. So what he's done here is he's also clipping in Distra Refractor and swapping that in. So Distra Refractor, it is a tank artifact, but you still get the health buff based on your dominance. The one thing you have to take into account is that it is similar to Tetra and Cog, where if there's another player using Distra Refractor, the highest buff is always taken and overrides the rest. So if your tank is running Refractor and you use it as a troll, the tank one is always going to supersede. So basically just wasted using that artifact. However, a lot of people in leagues or players that you run with, you're going to know if the tank is running Distra Refractor. So, I mean, you can always ask at the beginning, hey tank, are you going to use Refractor? It's not as common as an artifact. I personally use it for like Fire and Rage. I don't use it for any of the other tanks. But like I said, you may run into a tank that's using it. Just ask beforehand. The advantage is that you're getting not only the health buff from rings, but you're also getting the health buff from Refractor, tying into all the other buffs. The other change you'll see here as well, this applies to mental and gadgets. Technically you can get away with it because if you're not going to do the Refractor swap, you can also put the weapon buff on your primary loadout, but essentially he's also swapping in the Clarion shield. So this one, the advantage of being gadgets or mental is that you have access to that secondary loadout. So you can put the weapon buff on the secondary loadout, so when you swap to stealth or invis, you can then proc the weapon buff, which will proc the Clarion shield. And get some extra healing as well. So the same thing, usually some tanks run Clarion, some healers run Clarion. And same thing, it's going to over, if a Clarion has another Clarion, it's going to override. The Troll Clarion's not going to be as strong as some others, but like I said, it is optional that you can run that for the, extra protection for the group. So in event to normal, you're not going to have to worry about that whatsoever. The damage reduction is not going to really take effect just because of the content. Where if you are an Elite or Elite Plus, it's something extra you can do for that survivability. So with that, you see the rotation just going through, making sure that everything's applied. You also have trinkets like, say, OMAC Trinket, which technically does buff health. It also buffs your critical, so you're doing a little bit extra damage to precision. But technically, there is a small health buff. It's usually only like 1,000 health. But that's the thing. With a buff troller, you want to get as much health, obviously, as you can to be able to provide the maximum buffs to the group. So, like I said, I've shown the footage here. You can still, yes, people refer to as inventory controlling. And like I said, I'm not here to change a meta or change people's playstyle. All I'm doing is just offering options. So if you want to be a power troll, you can. But like I said before, it's not going to be as beneficial to the group. But then there's different levels of buff trolling where they don't involve artifact swapping. Something like just swapping one artifact to swapping between 3 artifacts, so then swapping 7 artifacts, and then here swapping in 11 and 12 artifacts. So there's different levels to the buff trolling. Each one is going to be based on your player preference and comfortability with artifact swapping. But like I said, it's all about, as the new playstyle for controllers is buff trolling. Power's not needed, debuffs aren't needed, basically. Your Bird's Blitz applying that, and then you don't have any crowd control either. So the main meta for controllers is buff trolling. It just depends on what degree you want to achieve it. So take care, guys. We'll see you in the next video.